Okay, folks, hope everybody's doing all right. I just wanted to make a little quick introductory video for the next unit of the class, the last unit of the class. So we've got two more chapters to go. Both of them are on moral philosophy. The first of these chapters is on metaethics, or what philosophers call metaethics. And the second chapter, chapter 7, is about normative ethical theory or prescriptive ethical theory. So I just wanted to make a little kind of mini lecture video here to set up these two chapters and what we'll be looking at the next part of the class, the last part of the class here. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my presentation and get started on that here. So pull that up for you. And so this chapter 7 again is on the foundations of ethics or metaethics. When philosophers talk about moral philosophy, they usually have three basic things in mind. And so there are kind of three basic branches of moral philosophy understood kind of broadly. The first of these areas is called metaethics. And again, that's on what chapter 7 is about. The second thing that they might have in mind is normative ethical theory, what your textbook just calls moral theory. And then another thing they might have in mind or be talking about is applied ethics. So when most lay people, non-philosophers, non-academic philosophers, when they're thinking about morality, what they're probably thinking about is what philosophers would call normative ethical theory or prescriptive ethical theory. Sometimes you'll hear philosophers call it first order moral theory. And normative ethics is about, it focuses on identifying and defending through an argument, right, or a set of arguments really, some standard, some moral principle that guides conduct or good living in some way. So morality isn't just about the way the world is, how we might describe the world. It's about the way we want human beings to act, right? So normative ethical theory tries to answer or identify a principle that would help us answer the question, what ought I do or how should I live, right? So everybody is probably familiar with a very common normative standard, a prescriptive standard. It's the golden rule. It says that you ought to treat other people the way that you would like them to treat you. That's a normative principle. It's a prescriptive standard. It guides conduct. It tells us how we want, how we ought to behave. If I don't like people randomly punching me in the face, then I should refrain from punching people randomly in the face, punching other people randomly in the face. So a normative theory attempts to identify some standard, some prescriptive standard that guides conduct or good living in some way. And there are a number of different prescriptive standards or normative theories. We're going to look at three in the next chapter: deontology, utilitarianism, and virtue ethics. Those are three different versions of normative theories that have been very influential in academic philosophy. And so, again, when we're talking about normative ethics or prescriptive morality, we're talking about identifying some standard of right conduct that or good living that would help us distinguish what kinds of actions are permissible to perform. In other words, I can either perform the action or refrain from performing the action, and it's not an issue, morally speaking, one way or another. So like, you know, I've got a blue pen here. I'm willing to bet that most people think it's morally permissible for me to use a pen with blue ink as opposed to black ink, for example, right? Or to wear a white t-shirt one day as opposed to a black t-shirt one day. So permissibility, right? Then other actions we want to classify or think ought to be prohibited or impermissible, actions that I have to refrain from performing, and if I don't refrain from performing them, then I've done wrong, right? I've done something that's incorrect, morally speaking. So a good example, a relatively uncontroversial example of some kind of claim like that is like, you shouldn't kill an innocent person for entertainment purposes, right? an obligatory or an action that I'm required to perform, that if I don't, then I have acted improperly in some way. So like, generally speaking, people think that you're obligated to tell the truth, this sort of thing, or to keep your promises, this sort of thing. So again, normative ethics is about identifying and defending some standard that helps us distinguish permissible, prohibited, and obligatory actions, or that guides conduct in some way, right? Or that helps us identify how we should live by picking out what sorts of character traits are good or bad, right? So picking out virtues as opposed to vices in some way, and then informs what kind of person I should be or what kind of character I should develop in order to live a certain kind of life. So that's the task of normative ethics, right? And then applied ethics is just applying those normative standards or moral principles to particular moral controversies: abortion, stem cell research, animal welfare, issues in professional ethics, right? This sort of stuff might arise. Issues about conflict of interest or something like that. Environmental ethics, nuclear deterrence, all sorts of issues that arise there. Ethics in sports or something like that, right? So that's applied ethics is just applying those normative standards to try to figure out a way to answer a moral controversy, right? Some of those moral controversies are pretty well known to you, euthanasia, this sort of thing. Oftentimes they make up their matters of social policy as well, or politics as well. So normative ethics, right, is about those standards. And then of course we make all sorts of moral claims and moral judgments all the time, both explicitly and implicitly, right? We assign value to things, to certain actions or character traits. We say that you ought not tell a lie, or you ought not, throw garbage down the in your neighbor's lawn or something like that, right? So we make evaluative statements. We make statements or prescriptive statements that issue value judgments in some way, or that presuppose a value judgment in some way. And so when we make claims about what we ought do or what we ought not do, or how we should live, we're making these sorts of prescriptive and evaluative or normative claims. And metaethics is about the status of those claims. And so that's sometimes philosophers, you'll hear philosophers talk about metaethics in terms of second order ethical theory. And metaethics is about the nature of normative or prescriptive claims, statements, and value judgments, right? And so it's a more abstract kind of aspect of morality. When we're talking about metaethics, we're really asking about what are the foundations, what's the status of morality. And what I mean by the foundations or status of morality is, one of the main issue for us in our textbook, main metaethical debate is about objectivity with regard to moral statements. So that's what I mean by the foundations. Are the foundations of morality, are there any universal and objectively true moral judgments, right? Normative claims? Or does morality, moral claims, do they all come down to something like maybe a matter of personal preference, such that there's no difference between a moral claim and like a claim about what I think is pretty or not pretty, or aesthetically pleasing or not? Or are moral judgments, are they relative to particular times and places, like a culture or a particular society? That's a big meta-ethical debate. And so that's what we'll be looking at in this next chapter, chapter 6. Again, chapter 7 is on normative ethical theory. So again, we're everyday people, in our normal, ordinary lives, we're typically thinking or making what philosophers would call normative claims or prescriptive claims. And then metaethics, those normative claims and normative principles that guide those individual moral judgments, they presuppose some metaethical account about the nature, foundations, or status of those normative claims themselves. And so that's what metaethics is about. at least what a lot of metaethics is about. There are, of course, other metaethical debates like the problem of moral motivation. Why be moral? That's the question of moral motivation. Maybe some stuff about moral psychology and the relationship between science there comes up with regard to metaethics. But for our purposes in Introduction to Philosophy here, what we're going to be worried about is the problem of objectivity. And so just ask yourself, when you make a moral judgment, and here I don't necessarily mean, although we might mean this as well, but I'm more focused on this idea of a moral judgment. When you're making a serious moral claim that you aren't treating flippantly, but as a serious matter, what is it that you take yourself to be doing when you make a moral evaluation, or when you make that evaluative judgment or statement, right? So I ask here, when we make moral judgments, i.e. normative prescriptive claims or judgments like you ought not lie, or you ought, or abortion is never permissible, abortion is sometimes permissible, or abortion is always permissible. So I'm not particularly worried about the exact content of that claim, just the nature of those prescriptive claims themselves, regardless of whether you're making a for or against evaluation. What's the nature of that evaluation? What kind of claims are we making, and what kind of claims what do those claims presuppose about the nature or foundations of morality, and of course those particular claims themselves? And so there are a couple of options here. One is that we might be making the claim that all moral judgments are merely expressions of subjective preferences. That would be something like individual relativism. We talked about individual relativism way at the beginning of the semester in the article by Johnson. He talked about individual relativism and cultural relativism there. So that's the view that there are no universal or objective moral truths. And by moral truth here, I mean a prescriptive claim, right? That's true, objectively speaking. And so the individual relativist says that all of morality is just a matter of personal preference, right? So if you've seen the latest Joker movie that came out in 2019 during the interview scene, that's his position. He says that morality is just like humor, right? And so since humor varies from individual to individual, he's making the claim that what counts as morally right or morally wrong is just a matter of personal preference, right? Now, the thing about the Joker is that he's not only does he hold that metaethical position, he sees no prudential reasons to abide by any moral judgments at all, or moral norms at all. And so he goes about, Joker gonna joke, right? Another option that we might think of here with regard to this question is that we might think that all moral judgments are expressions of cultural mores, right? And along with that there are no universal cross-cultural moral truths, that all moral truths, if we can speak of them as truths at all, they're only binding or only relative to or dependent upon a particular cultural consensus in a particular time and place. So that's the moral relativism, or the cultural relativist position. Another, and notice in those first two options, I have all, right? So those are fairly strong claims about the nature of morality, that all moral judgments are merely subjective preferences, or all moral judgments are merely expressions of cultural mores. Then this third option is a different type of option here. When we make moral judgments, we might be making some claims, at least some, right? At least one, right? That could be objectively true or universally true, based on divine decree. So that's the divine command theory perspective. It's an objectivist view of morality, and it's not only objectivist, but says that objective morality is rooted in divine will. Then we might, or we might be making another kind of claim. We might be expressing judgments, some of which can be objectively true via empirical verification, right? Or maybe based on the nature of the statements themselves. So they're maybe based on universal reason, right? And then I leave open here maybe other options that people might want to think about. If you hold one of those other views, you need to kind of spell that out a little bit. But so just sit and think for a minute here. Pause the video for a second and think about how you would answer that question, right? And so take a minute and think about that for a second, and then hit play, and we'll start back up here. All right, so hopefully you've thought about that question a little bit. Let me now kind of take a step back and motivate the problem of objectivity. What I mean by motivate the problem of objectivity here is show how it is an issue, right? Show why it's an issue for philosophers. So we've looked at the problem of objectivity previously in the semester. Back at the end of chapter 1, we thought about the possibility of objective philosophical statements, and at large, are any non-empirical philosophical claims objectively true? We looked at an argument about that. Now we're looking at the problem of objectivity just with regard to moral claims, again, prescriptive, evaluative claims, right? Claims that make value judgments. And so up here, I have this question: how, if at all, can moral judgments be objectively true? And then I ask you to consider the following two sets of claims. First, we have A, the earth is spherical, and A is the same in both sets here. So the earth is spherical. That's a claim that can be supposed to flat earth. Somebody's in the flat earth society and they disagree that the earth is spherical. They think that it is flat, right? It's a big, large disk. Well, how could we resolve the debate over that factual claim? Well, through empirical observation, the scientific method, and observation of the physical world, right? So at least in principle, if we got far enough out into outer space, we could look back and see whether the Earth has the property of being a spherical object or not, right? And so there's a way of resolving that debate. Is the issue, is the point here. If someone were to disagree about the claim that 2 + 2 = 4, we could talk about the nature of mathematics, and it looks like there's a way, right, of resolving that disagreement about the truth of the statement 2 + 2 = 4, right? And so in both of those examples, there's at least an in-principle method, in-principle way of resolving a conflict of attitudes or disagreement about the truth of those claims, right? But then take a look at the B line in each of these examples. So in the first one, I have lying is wrong, and in the second one, you ought not lie. Those are basically, although they're grammatically different, the meaning is basically the same, right? When we say lying is wrong, we're saying you ought not lie, right? So both of those statements are prescriptive statements, right? Well, suppose that someone disagreed with the truth of those statements. Maybe they thought, well, lying is okay sometimes, only under certain conditions. If the Nazis are knocking at my door and asking if I'm hiding any Jews, and I think Nazis are wrong and that Jews ought not be persecuted, and so I'd lie to the Nazi at the door, right? The murderer at the door. So the claim that lying is wrong as a general statement is false, right? It's maybe you ought not lie sometimes or something like that, right? So suppose someone disagrees about the truth of a prescriptive claim. So some people think that some prescriptive claims are true, and some others disagree. They think that those prescriptive claims are false, right? It doesn't look like there is a way to resolve the debate over the truth of a prescriptive claim in the way that we could resolve the debate over either an empirical claim or a debate over like a mathematical claim or a claim about pure logic or something like that, right? So that poses a curiosity then. How, if at all, could moral judgments, evaluative prescriptive statements, how could they be empirically verified? How could they be objectively true? They don't seem like to be the sorts of things that can be empirically verified. Whenever we look at a crime scene, we can observe all sorts of things about the crime scene, right? Everybody's seen CSI or some version of CSI, right? Where they're measuring, the time of death based on the rigor mortis in the body or the blood spatter pattern on the wall to determine where they were hit and with what they were hit and this sort of thing. So we can observe all sorts of things about the crime scene, but we never observe the wrongness of the crime in the same way that we never observe the wrongness the way that we do observe the sphericalness, or could observe the sphericalness of the earth, right? So there looks like a serious disanalogy, then a serious difference between factual claims on the one hand and prescriptive claims on the other, such that it raises the question, how, if at all, could these prescriptive claims be objectively true if they aren't empirically verifiable the way that the claims in line A are empirically verifiable. So that's what raises the problem of objectivity then. And so this is a big debate in metaethics. You might see and hear people talking about it as the debate between moral or ethical realism versus moral or ethical anti-realism. And for our purposes, I'm just using the phrase, the terms ethics and morality is synonymous, right? So both of those have to do with, right conduct and good living. And so the ethical objectivist side of this debate, sometimes it's called the realist anti-realist debate, and you see these realist anti-realist debates pop up in many areas of philosophy. And what we're worried about here is with regard to morality, and so ethical realism versus ethical anti-realism. So here are the basic ideas of each of these two sides. And again, here you notice that we have an apparent contradiction between these two different schools of thought, these two different sides of the debate. So ethical objectivism is the idea that there's at least one objective moral truth. And what I mean by moral truth here, again, is a prescriptive or evaluative claim. We're going to look at, in this next chapter, we're going to look at two basic objectivist or realist theories of metaethical theories. The first one is divine command theory. And then the next one that we'll look at is ethical objectivism. Really, there are different ways of flushing out ethical objectivism. Your book doesn't even talk about one of the options that I have listed here, ethical naturalism, precisely because it doesn't look like we can discover the truth of prescriptive claims via the scientific method. That's part of what we were looking at in that last slide, is the difference between a factual claim and a prescriptive claim. On the other side of the debate, we'll look at a couple of different views here. We're going to start off looking at cultural relativism, or what your book just calls moral relativism. And this is the idea. And so what all these moral relativism, individual relativism, ethical non-objectivism, or ethical subjectivism, however you want to say that, what all of those three perspectives share is that they all deny the possibility of objective, universal, prescriptive truths, right? Moral truths, right? And then, in addition to that, they go on to explain morality in one or more different ways. So the moral relativist says there are no cross-cultural universal moral truths, prescriptive truths. All prescriptive truths, if we can talk about them, if there are such things, are binding only within particular cultures. They're based on current cultural consensus and are only binding within particular cultures, within particular times and places. Individual relativism, again, is just the view that there are no universal or objective moral truths. Everything comes down with regard to morality to it being just a matter of personal preference, right? Some people like cheese pizza, other people like pepperoni on their pizza, right? And morality would be the same kind of thing there. And then at the end of the chapter, we'll look at ethical non-objectivism or ethical objectivism. And of course, we'll look at the other side of that debate as well. And so that's kind of the big picture for what we'll be doing in this next chapter 6. So I'll end this mini lecture here. So be sure you review it and take a moment to think about the issues that were raised in this section before you start the reading on moral relativism, which is the first reading out of chapter 7. Y'all have a good day and take care.